Nepal is a nation of breathtaking contrasts, a landlocked country nestled between the giants of India to the south and China to the north. For many around the world, its name conjures images of the majestic Himalayas, with Mount Everest standing as the planet's highest peak, a magnet for adventurers and spiritual seekers alike. Its geography is incredibly diverse, stretching from the high-altitude Arctic deserts of the Tibetan Plateau down to the humid subtropical jungles of the Terai Plains. This dramatic landscape is home to a population of approximately 30 million people, a rich mosaic of ethnicities, cultures, languages, and religions coexisting within its borders. Hinduism and Buddhism are the two predominant religions, and their influences are deeply embedded in the nation's art, architecture, and daily life, with sacred temples and ancient stupas dotting the landscape from Kathmandu Valley to remote mountain villages. Despite its natural beauty and cultural wealth, Nepal has faced significant political and economic hurdles. It transitioned from a monarchy to a federal democratic republic in 2008. However, the path has been rocky, marked by political infighting, frequent changes in government, and the immense challenge of rebuilding after the devastating 2015 earthquake. The nation's economy is heavily dependent on agriculture, tourism, and remittances, money sent home by the vast number of Nepalis who are compelled to seek work abroad, primarily in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, due to a lack of opportunities at home. While the remittances contribute a significant portion, over a third, to the country's gross domestic product, it comes at a social cost, with families separated and a constant brain drain of its youngest and most ambitious citizens. It is this backdrop of economic hardship, coupled with a deep-seated frustration with a political class perceived as out of touch and self-serving, that has created a fertile ground for the widespread discontent that recently erupted across the nation, challenging the very foundations of its current governance. The recent wave of protests that has shaken Nepal to its core is not a sudden outburst, but the culmination of years of simmering frustration primarily among the nation's youth. This demographic, often referred to as Generation Z, encompasses individuals between the ages of 13 and 28 who have grown up in a digital age, armed with information and a global perspective their parents never had. They are witnessing a stark disconnect between the promises of a democratic republic and the reality of their daily lives. A staggering youth unemployment rate, which hovered around 20% in the past year, has become a defining feature of their existence, leaving a generation of educated and ambitious young people with few prospects for a meaningful career within their own country. The government itself estimates that over 2,000 young Nepalis leave the country every single day, not as a choice, but as a necessity to find work and support their families back home. This mass exodus represents a profound loss of human potential for Nepal, draining the country of its future doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs, and leaders. At the heart of their rage is the pervasive issue of government corruption. For decades, Nepal has been plagued by a political culture where personal gain often seems to take precedence over public service. Young people, connected through social media and more aware than ever, see stories of embezzlement, bribery, and nepotism not as abstract political problems but as direct barriers to their own futures. They see public funds that could be used for education, healthcare, and job creation being squandered or siphoned off by a political elite that appears unaccountable. This perception of rampant corruption has eroded trust in the very institutions that are supposed to serve the people. The protests, therefore, are not just about a single policy or event. They are a collective roar from a generation that feels ignored, betrayed, and left behind. They are demanding more than just jobs. They are demanding systemic change. They are tired of the endless cycle of political instability and the culture of impunity that protects the powerful. Their anger is fueled by a potent combination of economic anxiety and moral outrage, a belief that the country's vast potential is being wasted by the very people entrusted with its care. This deep-rooted resentment created a tinderbox, needing only a single spark to set the nation ablaze. The widespread anger among Nepal's youth found a potent and highly visible symbol in the online phenomenon targeting Nepo kids. This term was coined to describe the children of politicians and powerful, well-connected figures who often use social media platforms to flaunt their lavish lifestyles. In a country where millions struggle with poverty and a lack of basic opportunities, images and videos of designer clothes, expensive cars, and luxurious vacations posted by the children of the elite became a galling display of inequality. This wasn't just about wealth, It was about the source of that wealth, and the unearned privilege it represented, seemingly derived from the very corruption that was holding the rest of the country back. This viral online movement struck a chord with hundreds of thousands of young Nepalese, because it made the abstract concept of corruption tangible and personal. It was no longer just a line item in a budget report or a whispered rumor about a backroom deal. It was a lived reality, broadcast in high definition for all to see. The stark contrast between the struggles of an average young person trying to find a job and the carefree opulence of a Nepo kid whose parent held a government position highlighted the deep-seated injustice within the system. It underscored the belief that success in Nepal was not about merit or hard work, but about who you know and who your parents are. The Nepo Kids movement served as a powerful organizing tool, uniting disparate voices into a coherent chorus of outrage. It provided a clear and relatable target for the public's anger, channeling widespread discontent into a focused campaign. Hashtags trended, memes were created, and online forums buzzed with shared stories of frustration. This digital groundswell demonstrated the power of social media to bypass traditional gatekeepers and create a national conversation on a topic the political establishment would have preferred to ignore. The movement effectively put a face to the systemic rot, making it impossible for anyone to deny the chasm that had grown between the ruling class and the citizens they were meant to serve. Ultimately, the focus on Nepo Kids was about more than just envy or resentment toward the wealthy. It was a powerful critique of a broken social contract. It symbolized a system where the path to prosperity was closed to the many, but wide open for a select few based on lineage rather than ability. This blatant display of nepotism and cronyism became a lightning rod for the broader fight against corruption and the demand for a more equitable society. It was a clear and infuriating example of the two Nepals that had emerged, one for the connected elite, another for everyone else, fueling the righteous anger that would soon spill from screens onto the streets. Just as the online movement against corruption and Nepo Kids was reaching a fever pitch, the government of Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli made a fateful decision. Presented as a measure to maintain social order and to curb misinformation, the government imposed a sweeping ban on major social media platforms, Facebook, TikTok, and other platforms. This was meant to silence dissent and regain control of the narrative. Instead, it poured fuel on public discontent, turning an online movement into a physical uprising. The ban was perceived by the youth as censorship, a desperate move to muzzle them. For a generation raised on these platforms, to communicate, to organize, to express, being cut off felt like an attack on their rights. Social media was where they found a community, built momentum, and shared grievances. Taking it away proved the government wasn't listening, and confirmed suspicions that the elite feared their power. The ban's timing was incendiary. It hit as the youth-led anti-corruption campaign was peaking. Shutting platforms validated claims the elite had something to hide. The tactic backfired. It looked like fear, not strength. Protesters realized their activism worked and were emboldened to act. Result: mass mobilization onto the streets. Digital protest had nowhere to go but physical. Chants and marches filled the streets of Kathmandu and other cities. The ban became a unifying grievance spreading beyond Nepo Kids, beyond unemployment, into a fight for freedom of expression. What began as scattered digital protests soon coalesced into a massive physical presence in the heart of the nation. Young people now poured into the streets of Kathmandu and other urban centers across Nepal. The initial gatherings were charged with an energy that was both defiant and determined. Protesters, many of them students and young professionals, brandished homemade signs defying corruption, demanding jobs, and protesting the censorship they were now experiencing firsthand. The scale of the protests grew at an astonishing rate. Initial crowds of hundreds quickly swelled into thousands, then tens of thousands, creating the largest and most intense period of civil unrest Nepal had seen in decades. The sheer number of demonstrators overwhelmed the initial police response, turning major thoroughfares and public squares into seas of people. The movement was decentralized and leaderless, organized through encrypted messaging apps and word of mouth, making it difficult for authorities to target and dismantle. This leaderless structure was a hallmark of its Gen Z origins, reflecting a new form of activism that was fluid, adaptable, and deeply democratic. As the days wore on, and the government failed to respond to their demands, the mood of the protests began to shift. The initial peaceful demonstrations grew more confrontational as frustration mounted. Clashes with riot police became more frequent and intense. Protesters, initially armed only with slogans and signs, began to push back against police lines. Police responded with tear gas, water cannons, and batons. The streets of the capital became a battleground with the sounds of chanting and sirens filling the air day and night. The unrest was no longer confined to specific protest sites, but began to spill over into the daily life of the city, creating a pervasive sense of crisis. The escalation was not limited to clashes with police. Protesters' anger shifted from the abstract state to physical symbols of government power. They defied curfew orders, viewing them as another illegitimate tool of oppression. The movement was rapidly evolving from a demand for reform into a direct challenge to government authority. The sheer momentum of the crowds, fueled by a shared sense of purpose and outrage, created a volatile and unpredictable situation. The government had lost control of the narrative, and it was quickly losing control of the streets as well. The simmering anger reached its explosive zenith on a Tuesday that will forever be etched in Nepal's history, as tens of thousands of protesters, having defied a government-imposed curfew, converged on the heart of the country's political power in Kathmandu. Their target was the Parliament building, the very symbol of the democratic system they felt had failed them. In a shocking and unprecedented act of defiance, the demonstrators breached the security cordons and stormed the legislative complex. The scenes that followed were ones of pure chaos, broadcast around the world, as the seat of Nepal's government was overrun by a wave of furious citizens who had finally broken past the gates. Once inside, the protesters' rage was unleashed. Parts of the Parliament building were set on fire, flames and thick black smoke billowing into the sky, a dramatic visual metaphor for the state of the nation. The destruction was not limited to the legislature. Demonstrators also targeted other key government offices, including the Supreme Court, setting them ablaze in a systematic rejection of all branches of state authority. The rampage extended to the private residences of top political leaders, which were also attacked and burned. It was a visceral and violent rejection of the entire political elite, whom the protesters held responsible for the nation's deep-seated problems of corruption and inequality. The violence also spread to other institutions perceived as being part of the establishment. The offices of Kantipur Publications, one of the country's leading daily news media organizations, were also set on fire, reflecting a deep distrust of traditional media outlets. In a further sign of the complete breakdown of law and order, demonstrators began to storm prisons across the country. They broke open the gates and freed inmates, leading to the escape of over 13,000 prisoners nationwide in just 2 days. The mass escape compounded the security crisis facing the state. This dramatic escalation marked a point of no return. The act of setting fire to the parliament was more than just property destruction. It was a potent symbolic act. It signaled that the protesters were no longer asking for a seat at the table. They were intent on flipping the table over entirely. The government, which had already lost its moral authority, now lost its physical grip on the capital. The storming of Parliament was the final decisive blow that led to the collapse of the existing government structure and plunged the nation into a profound state of uncertainty, forcing an immediate and drastic response from the country's last remaining stable institution. In the face of the complete breakdown of civil order, the storming of Parliament, the government of Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli effectively collapsed. Oli officially tendered his resignation. The Prime Minister reportedly fled the capital and sought refuge in an army barracks in Shivapuri at Budanilkantha. President Ramchandra Paudel accepted the resignation and tasked Oli with heading a caretaker government, though Oli's authority and whereabouts were unclear, creating a dangerous power vacuum. With civilian government in disarray and police overwhelmed, the Nepali army moved to intervene. At around 10 o'clock at night, the military announced it would take charge to ensure law and order. A monumental step for Nepal, a country with delicate civil-military relations. The army framed the move not as a coup but as necessary to prevent anarchy and safeguard the state. Military first actions: deployed troops on Kathmandu streets, enforced an indefinite curfew, established checkpoints, guarded key government installations that remained, and patrolled main areas of the capital. The sight of the army brought a tense, uneasy calm. For many residents, the presence was a welcome restoration of order and a worrying sign of democratic failure. Nepal under de facto military rule. The deployment signaled a new, uncertain chapter. It quelled large-scale riots, but underlying political issues remained unresolved. The military's role stabilized the situation, but could not fix the crisis of legitimacy. The government had fallen, the prime minister had fled, and the army was now in control. What happens next? The nation held its breath, temporary bridge to a new political solution, or the beginning of a more prolonged period of authoritarian rule. The cost of Nepal's Gen Z uprising has been immense, measured both in human lives and in the severe disruption to the nation's economy. The clashes between protesters and security forces, along with the widespread arson and violence, resulted in a tragic loss of life. Initial reports from the Ministry of Health confirmed at least 30 people killed and more than 1,033 injured. These figures mark the deadliest period of civil unrest the country has seen in decades, a grim testament to the state's eventual crackdown and the ensuing riots. The economic fallout was immediate and crippling. Authorities shut down Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu for a full 24 hours. The departure hall sat empty with flight information boards showing "canceled." All flights were grounded, stranding thousands of travelers, including tourists vital to the economy. Major international carriers like Air India and Indigo canceled all their services. The airport closure, along with the shutdown of schools, businesses, and government services, brought the nation's economic life to a complete standstill. The physical destruction of property has left deep scars on the capital. The Parliament building in flames, the Supreme Court in flames, other government offices on fire, the burning of private homes of political leaders, and the offices of a major media house. Mass prison breaks saw over 13,000 inmates escape, creating a massive internal security crisis and diverting law enforcement resources. Beyond the immediate damage, the long-term economic consequences are profound. The political instability and images of violence are likely to devastate Nepal's tourism industry. Investor confidence, both domestic and foreign, has been shattered. The crisis has laid bare the fragility of Nepal's economy and its structural problems. Rebuilding will require reconstructing burned buildings and restoring the trust and stability necessary for economic recovery, a monumental task. As the dust begins to settle on the streets of Kathmandu, with the military enforcing an uneasy peace, Nepal finds itself at a critical crossroads. The old government has collapsed, and the nation is facing the urgent task of charting a path forward out of the political vacuum. The immediate future hinges on a series of delicate negotiations that have begun between the key stakeholders. Representatives from the Nepali army, President Ramchandra Paudel, and delegates representing the Gen Z youth protesters are set to engage in talks to determine the leadership and composition of an interim government. This inclusion of the youth protesters is a significant acknowledgement of their power and legitimacy. The central challenge of these negotiations is to form a transitional government that can win the trust of the public and steer the country towards new elections. The protesters have made it clear that they will not accept a return to the old guard of established political parties whom they hold responsible for the crisis. A prominent name that has emerged as a potential consensus candidate to lead this interim administration is that of former Chief Justice Sushila Karki. Known for her integrity and anti-corruption stance during her tenure, she is seen by many in the protest movement as a credible figure who could oversee a period of genuine reform and ensure a fair transition. These events are profoundly important for Nepal's future. The uprising has irrevocably changed the country's political landscape. It has demonstrated that the youth are a formidable political force that can no longer be ignored. Their demands for an end to corruption, for economic opportunity, and for a more accountable government are now at the center of the national conversation. The success or failure of the upcoming negotiations will determine whether Nepal can peacefully transition to a more inclusive and just political system, or whether it will relapse into instability, or worse, fall under prolonged military oversight. The outcome will set the course for the nation's democratic journey for years to come. What happens next will be a test of Nepal's resilience. The path forward requires a delicate balance, addressing the legitimate grievances of the protesters, ensuring stability, and upholding democratic principles. The formation of a credible interim government is the essential first step toward healing the nation's wounds and rebuilding trust between the citizens and the state. The world is watching to see if this Himalayan nation can emerge from the ashes of this crisis to forge a new social contract, one that finally delivers on the promise of a prosperous and equitable future for all its people, especially the young generation that so bravely demanded it.